You know, there's something about good apocalyptic fiction, and I mean, how many times on this channel have we covered a story about the end of the world? Usually our collective lights are snuffed out through some bombastic event, whether it's invaders from beyond the stars, the dead rising to consume the living, or the creation of a man-made horror resulting in the end of humanity. Then, however, there's a movie like John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness. A movie which looks at not only the end of days, but the very nature of our reality. While In the Mouth of Madness is an homage to Lovecraftian horror, with the title itself being a play on At the Mountains of Madness, the film is also a commentary on the nature of storytelling itself, how the written world can influence and bend reality if the reader is willing to believe it. It's an exploration of insanity in the context of metafiction. This is what we'll be discussing in today's video as we take a look at John Carpenter's 1994 cult classic, In the Mouth of Madness. John Carpenter has had an extremely prolific career in film. He is, of course, one of the forefathers of the modern-day slasher movie after the breakout success of 1978's Halloween, but he was also responsible for some of the most beloved cult movies of the 80s, with legendary titles like Escape from New York. We gotta cover that on the channel at some point. There's a lot of world building there. The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, and They Live. However, the 90s weren't as shining for his career, with nearly every movie he directed being both a critical and commercial flop. In the Mouth of Madness, however, stands out among the others, and while it never did have a major critical reevaluation, it does have a small and passionate fan base, largely due to the overall draw, I think, of surreal and Lovecraftian horror, which allows it to stand out, especially compared to his other movies. Let's talk plot though, and the movie centers on the disappearance of an author known as Sutter Kane, who acts as a sort of hybrid of Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft. Skeptic John Trent is hired to investigate the claim and discover if Sutter's disappearance is real or an elaborate publicity stunt. By the way, John Trent is played by Sam Neill himself, which reminds me, there is a novelization for Event Horizon which expands on the film a bit. If this video does well, maybe I'll cover that sooner rather than later. Anyway, from this point on, I will be going into spoilers for the movie, so if you haven't watched it yet, I implore you, do so with the limited amount of information I've given you. This is a movie that really shines when you go in without expectations, and this video should be more of a companion rather than a replacement. With that out of the way, let's start by looking at our three key characters of the movie. The protagonist, John Trent, is introduced to us as he's dragged, kicking and screaming, into a mental asylum and taken to a padded room where he asserts that he does not belong there and that he is not insane. Classic insane person thing to say, and it's even echoed by his neighboring occupants. Insanity and the distinction between sane and insane is one of the film's primary explorations, with Trent serving as the audience surrogate. I mean, that's perhaps a bit surprising given that he's introduced as a raving harbinger of doom, but everything in the story follows a very specific design meant to question the viewer's perspective. Do you believe the screaming man in a straitjacket or the ones that confined him? We're, from the very beginning, meant to distrust our eyes and see the narrator as a potentially unreliable storyteller. Either way, as Trent recounts the story of how he wound up in the asylum, he's given practically no backstory aside from the fact that he's an insurance investigator who views himself as heavily grounded in reality. He makes his living and really only finds joy in disrupting the fantasies of others. This is countered by our secondary protagonist, Linda Stiles, an editor for Arcane Publishing. Unlike Trent, she makes a living indulging the fantasies of others. She's the sole editor for our third major character of the movie, Sutter Kane, who doesn't have a large on-screen role, though of course his presence is felt throughout the entire movie. Kane's name is an obvious play on Stephen King, and as mentioned, he's kind of a hybrid between him and the main inspiration for the horrors featured in this movie, H.P. Lovecraft. It's made abundantly clear that Kane is not a replacement for King in the reality of the movie, as Linda mentions that Kane outsells him. Carpenter previously directed an adaptation of King's novel Christine, and King is also known to be a vocal critic of the films based on his work, so I was curious whether this was a jab at King for comments made against his movie. The only thing I could find was that he thought the adaptation was boring, but those comments were made a decade after the release of In the Mouth of Madness. Carpenter also didn't write the screenplay for the movie and has since contributed to the score for 2022's adaptation of King's novel Firestarter, so it doesn't seem, at least presently, like the two actively hate each other, but who knows what was going on in the 90s. Either way, Kane is ultimately the antagonist of the movie, acting as a herald for the apocalypse chosen by the Old Gods, essentially Lovecraftian gods who guided Kane's writing to gain power through belief. The movie establishes the idea that certain less stable readers of Kane's work experience symptoms common with those suffering from schizophrenia. This is where the main plot of the film kicks off, when Trent encounters Kane's agent, who is deeply affected by the author's latest work titled In the Mouth of Madness. The question of whether or not this affliction is psychological or supernatural is presented to the audience and also introduces the parallel between the fictional Sutter Kane's novel and the movie itself. The grounded in reality John Trent begins reading Kane's work and starts to have visions and nightmares of the horrors Kane describes, but maintains that they are not reality. This all shifts once Trent and Linda are sent to find Hobb's End, a seemingly fictional town featured in Kane's work and the location of his suspected disappearance. Now, it's important to note that the two characters don't really have chemistry, yet they're pushed into a romantic relationship, and one could suggest that it's the classic odd couple pairing, but I think it goes a step beyond that. The two characters have such a deep, unspoken dislike for each other, Trent even being outwardly awful to her. This begins shifting towards the second act of the movie, and as Linda begins buying into the fact that Kane's writing may not be fictional after all. For the first time in the plot, the perspective changes from Trent to Linda as she begins seeing the events from Kane's unreleased book unfolding before them. Linda reveals that only she and Kane's now deceased agent have read In the Mouth of Madness, though she doesn't know about the ending. This is the turning point for Linda. She has bought into Kane's reality and has fallen under the spell of his writing. She steals the car key so Trent can't leave and attempts to seduce him despite her not showing any interest in him up to that point. This is where the metafiction explored in the plot begins to come to the surface through the suspected psychosis of Kane's effect on his readers. Linda, an open-minded reader of his writing, is able to discern between fiction and reality, and is even able to grapple with having read In the Mouth of Madness until she reads the conclusion. One townsperson appears to have some level of autonomy through discussions with Trent, but still ultimately follows their written fate in the Mouth of Madness, leaving Trent with the haunting line, "I can't remember what came first, us or the book. Reality is not what it used to be." This marks the point of no return for not only Trent, but the audience as well. Hobb's End, the fictional town which shouldn't exist, has become the only reality Trent fits into. He's a one-dimensional skeptic and cynic, but he actively is trying to break the mold of who he was. The plot needs him to move forward, but he wants nothing more than to escape the horrors in front of him and return to what reality was. This leads us to the final act. Sutter Kane ascends to godhood and reveals to John Trent that both he and Hobb's End were written into existence by Kane. Trent is a work of fiction whose only goal is to bring the completed manuscript back to Arcane in order to bring about the end of days. By the time Trent escapes Hobb's End and returns to his world, it's already too late. The book has been published with a film adaptation released. The public, hungry for Kane's work, has devoured it, and in doing so, they've made it real. Trent has lost reality entirely, the passage of time happens sporadically, locations change suddenly and unexpectedly as the world falls further into chaos through the growing popularity of In the Mouth of Madness, as he is forced reluctantly to accept himself as a fictional character. This is where The Mouth of Madness reveals its final devastating trick. It's not just about the cosmic horrors. This is a commentary on the way stories, especially mass consumed ones, change the people they impact. Let's flip this with a real-world example we're all familiar with, Star Wars. Compare the popularity and ferocity of Kane's book to the original trilogy, which was treated by some like a religion. Some Star Wars fans are more than just fans, they're followers. For them, the franchise goes beyond simply entertainment. It reshapes reality and, in a way, thus reshapes society. It's really about the consumerism of storytelling, and at a certain point in the movie, Trent is even told that more people believe in the words of Kane than the Bible. Media as a new religion, fan bases, the denominations. What happens when fiction becomes scripture, not because it's true, but because it's popular? People don't just read or watch stories, they live them. People define themselves by the things they enjoy, buying the merch, debating the lore, and picking and choosing what aspects to consider canon or real. This all culminates with the conclusion of the movie. The Mouth of Madness, having disseminated through the population, has brought the old gods back, and as Trent walks through a deserted city and enters a theater playing the film adaptation, he sees himself on screen, and the ultimate metafictional twist comes full circle. Trent sits and laughs and enjoys what the audience has been seeing and made to enjoy the entire time. He finds enjoyment and humor in the surrealism and his own suffering, the same way we did, and can do nothing but laugh as his reality ends with the end credits. And this really is all I have to say about In the Mouth of Madness. I hope this video motivates more people to check out the film. It's incredibly surreal, Lovecraftian. It touches on the idea, you SCP fans will enjoy this, that sometimes the danger is in the data or the information itself. Just learning it or knowing it presents the hazard. But it's a fun and surreal experience which plays with the fourth wall in a much more interesting and less in-your-face way than a lot of other movies, while still offering great visuals and a very different kind of horror. But what film would you like to see us look at next? Is there one in particular, especially in this vein, that you really appreciate? Let us know down below, and I'll see you next time.